I guess that natural disasters, like that Boxing Day tsunami of 2004, challenge people across all faith positions. I think they particularly challenge Christians because they say, how can a God of love allow 300,000 people to die? I think they challenge atheists, people of no faith, because it challenges the hubris that we can control our environment, that technology and science will enable us to do whatever we want to do. So I think they're interesting things to look at, and that's why I wanted to talk today about natural disasters, and I've enjoyed researching this. Are they acts of God? Can we blame God? Are they the results of human folly? Should we blame humans? Well, let me start with an event which rocked the Western world. It happened on All Souls' Day 1755 in the morning in Lisbon, when the population, devout population, were all in church. And there was a major earthquake offshore which caused a lot of the buildings to collapse, and it actually ended up killing something like 40,000 people. Now, that wasn't the only terrible thing that happened, because also massive fires were started in the city, not least from the candles in the churches, but also the bakeries and so on. And they raged out of control. And then, blow me if that wasn't enough, with fire and earthquake, about 2 hours later a tsunami hit, because it was an offshore earthquake, and actually drowned a good number of the survivors. And this really rocked the Western world on its heels, because it was the time of the Enlightenment, and people were just getting confidence in their own ability to control the world. And this upset it. Let me show you some of the things that were written about that occasion. This is a copper engraving from the time, showing the fire, the flood and the pestilence. And actually it was held up for many years as a religious event, that these earthquakes were due to the wrath of God, some terrible things that have been going on maybe in Lisbon. Well, Voltaire wrote this shortly after the disaster at Lisbon. He wrote a poem with the title An Examination of That Axiom That All Is Well. Now, this was pointing directly at Leibniz. Leibniz was a great mathematician. He invented calculus, but he was also a theologian. He invented the term theodicy, which means, how can a good God allow suffering? And basically, his idea was that we live in the best of all possible worlds, and suffering was therefore just a necessary consequence, because God couldn't fail to have invented, created the best of all possible worlds. Well, Voltaire was disgusted by this, really, and he raised issues which are still relevant today and which we'll try and look at in the rest of this talk. So this is what he said: will you say this disaster is a result of eternal laws directing the acts of a free and good God? In other words, is it just a natural consequence of the laws of nature? Or will you see, in seeing this mass of victims, God is revenged, their death is the price for their crimes? And we heard exactly the same after the Asian tsunami, didn't we, in Sumatra? Many people said this was due to the sinfulness. You just put your pet hate of whatever you hate most, you say it was due to that. This was due to homosexuality, this was due to Muslims, this was due to the vice of Westerners coming on holiday in Sumatra, anything you like. So Voltaire picked up on those two, and he went on to say, what crime, what error did these children, these innocent children, crushed and bloody on their mothers' breasts, commit? Did Lisbon, which is no more, have more vices than London and Paris, immersed in their pleasures? Lisbon is destroyed and they dance in Paris. Well, as I said, this sent shockwaves right across the Western world. And those issues that Voltaire raised still stand today. Well, in response to Voltaire, Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the philosopher, wrote a letter to him. And this is what he said: I don't see how one can search for the source of moral evil anywhere but in man. For example, it was hardly nature that brought together 20,000 houses of 6 or 7 stories in Lisbon. If the residents of this large city had been more evenly dispersed and less densely housed, the losses would have been fewer, or perhaps none at all. Everyone would have fled at the first shock. but many obstinately remained. How many unfortunates perished in this disaster through the desire to fetch their clothing, their papers, or their money? Now, Rousseau was of that ilk that said we ought to go back to nature and everything will be fine. The sort of ilk that you sometimes hear in the Western world, that the vices of this world would all go away if we could all go back to some idyllic time in the Middle Ages when we lived on pasture land. Well, that would work in Europe, wouldn't work in New Zealand because there weren't any of you here then. And I think it would be pretty nasty to go back to the Middle Ages. Life was pretty short and brutish and you died of all sorts of nasty diseases. So actually I don't think that is a solution. But it did lead Rousseau to write this in his book Émile. You can read it in the French if you want. But basically he said, everything is good as it leaves the hands of the author of things. Everything degenerates in the hands of man. So he was putting the blame fairly and squarely on human sinfulness now. Well, I think they raised that event in Lisbon, as I say, it really changed the thinking of Enlightenment thinking. It raised all sorts of issues which are still relevant today. And I'll come back and try to explore some of those in a minute. This is the layout of what I want to do. I want to talk about some scientific issues first, then very briefly, some practical responses to this, because I don't just want to be a theoretical armchair theorist sitting here. I want to say what can we do in reality, and then some theological issues last. So let's start with scientific issues. And I just want to talk through some of the disasters that strike humankind. Well, I want to show you, first of all, a series of maps which are really clever maps because the area of the countries is scaled to whatever it is I'll be showing you. So this is scaled to the true area. Mercator projections are renownedly terrible, but this is true area now. So let's look in the world at those people affected by disasters. Dominantly not in the high-income countries, Southeast Asia, Africa. What about those killed by disasters? Same sort of distribution. What about those killed by droughts? Well, I think we're all aware that the most dangerous place to live for droughts is Africa, because they're living on the edge already. If you get a drought that lasts 2 years, you're more likely to die. Killed in earthquakes? Actually, Africa is pretty safe from earthquakes, but Southeast Asia still comes up pretty strongly, as well as parts of Europe and North America. But the dominant area, the biggest impact, is there in Southeast Asia. Killed by floods. We'll come back to all these in a minute. South America is a pretty bad place to live. So is Asia, India, Bangladesh, China. Pretty dangerous places. You're liable to get killed by floods. And I want to just point out that this correlates pretty closely with poverty, in fact. And the reason, of course, is obvious, that you can live in Netherlands, which is large parts of it are below sea level, but you're a rich enough country to actually build a sea wall to defend yourself. If you live in Bangladesh and you're a subsistence farmer, Bangladesh is a delta where 10 million people live within a metre of sea level, then of course you can't protect yourself. You can't build a sea wall around a delta to protect yourself. And so often the suffering is largely related to the poverty. And there are 1.6 billion people living on less than $2 a day in this world today. This is a shocking statistic, I think. Mortality, 1 to 4 years, from all sorts of reasons: lack of health care, dirty water, disease, malnutrition. Again, it's just the same areas over and over again. So if this isn't a case of morality, where those of us in the high-income countries are fine, thank you very much, those of us who are suffering are living in low-income countries, I don't know what is. It's not necessarily the disaster per se, I suppose, is the point I want to make. I think poverty, inequity, injustice often turns a natural process into what we call a natural disaster. Poverty often turns a natural process into a disaster, and that's one of the thrusts of this part of the talk. So let's talk about volcanic eruptions, for example. Actually, although they're pretty scary things to think of, actually they don't kill many people. In fact, most fatalities from volcanic eruptions are volcanologists, because when a volcanic eruption happens, most people run away, volcanologists run towards it. And I'm serious about that. That is really the case. We get good warning of volcanic eruptions, generally speaking, and people can move out of the way. So they're not actually particularly dangerous. In fact, in Iceland, where it's the most volcanic country in the world, the entire island is volcanic. They're a great tourist attraction, actually. And the last time Krafla erupted a few years ago, it was on a public holiday in the winter, and 10,000 people drove from Reykjavik to Krafla, which is about 3 hours' drive away, to see the show. And actually, it didn't cause a disaster, but coming back there was a big snowstorm, and they nearly had a major problem on their hands because you had to go over a mountain to get back to Reykjavik, and people almost died. They had helicopters out and mountain rescue teams, all kinds of things, to rescue people in their cars, not the volcano. In fact, nobody's been killed in the last 100 years in Iceland from a volcanic eruption, although it is erupting almost every year somewhere, except for a couple of German tourists who happened to be hiking on Hekla when that erupted. Well, let's give another example from much further back. Akrotiri, it's in the Mediterranean, on Santorini. And there's a beautiful Bronze Age village preserved there. Massive eruption. It was a caldera eruption like the one that generated the Taupo caldera. Caused a tsunami throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Possibly was actually at the time of the time the Israelites left Egypt. And massive earthquakes were obviously associated with it as well. But actually nobody was killed, as far as we can tell, on Akrotiri, which was right by the centre of the volcano, because it was covered by ash. When you excavate the ash, you find these storage jars. By and large, they'd taken away their grain. No bodies at all were found, at all, except for one pig, which had obviously got left behind for some reason. The houses and things are all intact. There's some suggestion there might have been an earthquake because this staircase is cracked, but that may or may not be the case. But clearly people had warning and they escaped. Now, a less happy outcome was an eruption on Ascension Day 1902 in Martinique, which killed 26 to 36,000 people. Some beautiful photos from a contemporary photographer here. Now, the interesting thing about this was, again, they knew there was a danger there, that it was likely to erupt because it had been belching out smoke and stuff for weeks. And there was an election due, and the mayor wanted everybody to stay in town so he could get re-elected. And so some people were leaving. He was persuading them not to leave, and in fact, not only not to leave, but to move from the farms into the town of Martinique. A few people did leave on boats, but most stayed behind. And in fact, when the eruption happened, it was one of these clouds of burning gas called nuée ardente, which rolls at about 50 miles an hour right across the town. It's at about 1,000 degrees. It burns up all the oxygen, and you're burnt and suffocated. It lasts about 3 minutes, and then it's gone. But that killed everybody in that town, except for one person, whom I'll tell you about in a minute, because that's quite interesting. I think this particular one is a very poignant shot, actually, of this graveyard with Christ on the cross, with the volcano erupting in the background. That's what it looked like after the eruption. And the person who survived was this guy called Ludger Silbaris, who was a bit of a brawler. And he'd had a fight the night before, and he'd been chucked into the local prison. The local prison, solitary confinement, was actually a magazine where they kept explosives normally, but it was empty. So there was no window in it. There was just a vent in the bottom of the doorway, and it was half underground. So when this cloud of burning gases rolled over, he actually urinated on his shirt, stuffed it in the vent at the bottom of the door, held his breath, and survived. And they found him 2 days later, and they gave him a pardon, actually, because they thought if he'd survived that, he deserved one. Well, then he toured with the Barnum and Bailey show as a sort of freak survivor of this catastrophe, and he died about 10 years later. He was the only survivor, and you might say that this really was due to human carelessness in letting people stay when they shouldn't have. Here's another example in Iceland, where I work. There was a big eruption, the biggest historic eruption in the world, actually, in 1793. And it caused the deaths of 76% of the horses, 50% of the cows, and 79% of the sheep. We now know it wasn't that they were buried in lava, it's they died of fluoridosis, because a lot of fluorine came out with the volcanic gases. And nowadays, if there's ever an eruption in Iceland, they put all the cows indoors and feed them off hay till that danger is gone. No people were killed at all, actually, in this case. It caused, actually, a terrible summer in Northern Europe. Nothing particularly unusual about that, but Benjamin Franklin, actually, was the US ambassador in Paris at the time, and he wrote a wonderful paper in the Manchester Philosophical Journal, which, being in Cambridge, you can go to the shelf and pull it off, you know, from 1793. And he said he thought this terrible weather, the unseasonable fogs and cold weather they were having in the whole of Northern Europe, actually, as well as Paris, was due to an eruption, probably in Iceland, he thought. He got the wrong volcano, but he didn't do badly, I thought. People knew what was happening, but the next winter, 25% of the people in Iceland died. Isn't that shocking? They died of famine because their livestock had died, they had no food. Now, Iceland is a sort of isolated little island, a bit like New Zealand, a bit colder, in the middle of the sea. It was a Danish enclave, if you like, and the Danes could easily have sent a boat of relief supplies. There weren't that many people on Iceland, and they didn't. They were trying to subjugate Iceland, keep them under their control a bit. And so they didn't send aid, and neither did anybody else, and 25% of the people died. So in a sense, you can say this is due to human failing as well, can't you? Well, that's volcanic eruptions. What about earthquakes? We're all aware, I guess, of the Sichuan earthquake in China last year, a magnitude 8 earthquake which killed more than 70,000 people. 5 to maybe as many as 11 million people are homeless. And one of the big issues that came up after that was that a lot of the buildings that collapsed were rather shoddily built government buildings, particularly schools. There was a disproportionate death rate amongst children because schools collapsed. On the right you can see a hospital that collapsed. And if you have a disaster and the hospital collapses, it just compounds the problems, of course. But one of the other problems is shown in the picture on the left, which is a common problem, actually, with earthquakes, that the infrastructure is destroyed and roads are blocked. So you can't get aid in very easily. And I have to say that I wouldn't like to live in Wellington for that very reason. There's only 3 easy access points, access roads. One of them runs along a major fault. So if there's... I'm sorry, Geoffrey, but... Geoffrey's got a beautiful house which is about a metre above Wellington Harbour. And there's very likely to be a tsunami as well. I don't know why we're laughing, really, but there we go. Sichuan, interestingly, this is a paper that just came out recently in Science magazine. It looks likely that that particular earthquake was triggered by water from this reservoir that had just been filled up recently, that water got into the fault and lubricated it. So all sorts of issues relating to human causation here, not only of the earthquake itself in this case, at the particular time it occurred at least, but as well the buildings that collapsed and killed people. About a decade ago there was an earthquake in Izmit in Turkey, a magnitude 7.6, which killed up to 40,000 people. And again, it was buildings falling down that killed people. It's buildings that kill people in earthquakes, I'm afraid. Now, interestingly, Turkey had perfectly good building codes, very similar to those of California. And the buildings should not have fallen down. And there were lots of stories afterwards about how builders had cut corners, they'd not obeyed the building codes. Even in one case, they'd put oil drums in the walls, the concrete walls, to reduce the amount of concrete they had to pour. Insufficient reinforcement and so on. These buildings need not have fallen down. We knew perfectly well how to build them. Turkey knew perfectly well how to build them. They had building codes in place. But because of corruption, those have been circumvented. I mean, this is a picture that I often show my students when I'm lecturing on this, because this mosque with a minaret, a prayer minaret, which goes out the top of the picture actually, it goes up 150 foot, and I haven't got the whole of it in there. It's about 150 years old, and that survived perfect. Even that big, tall, thin tower survived the earthquake, whereas in the foreground you can see tower blocks that are just piles of rubble now. It is just the building code and the lack of obedience to them. And I love this picture. This is actually the fault break. This fault break in Izmit actually went through this lady's house. The chicken is just stepping across the fault break. It's just here. And this house, you can see it's a traditional build house. It's got cross-braced timbers with bricks filling up. Now, I guess they probably have a bit of difficulty closing the doors because it's a bit crooked, but it didn't fall down. It didn't hurt anybody. So somewhere along the line, we've lost the building codes that we used to have. And we've got perfectly good building codes now, but people disobey them. Now, I want to give you a tale of 2 earthquakes, which is quite illuminating, actually. In California, on the 18th of October 1989, a place called Loma Prieta, there was a magnitude 7 earthquake and 57 people died. Some of you might remember this. The freeways collapsed and squashed some cars. You can see a picture of those, 2 pictures of that here. I think it was the Bay Bridge freeway, and they were due to strengthen it against earthquake failure, and they'd been working their way around the freeways. They hadn't got round to this one. This one collapsed, 57 died. Now, just 10 months earlier, in Armenia, a place called Spitak, there was a magnitude 6.9 earthquake, almost the same type of earthquake, strike-slip earthquake, same depth it originated from. And this time, more than 25,000 people died in that earthquake. And again, it was because buildings fell down. And the buildings had been constructed during Brezhnev's premiership, and they were just shoddily built. Now again, the USSR, as it was then, you knew perfectly well how to build things, just as they did in California, how to build them to protect against earthquakes, but they didn't. They cut corners. I mean, they could make nuclear bombs, for goodness sake. Just building a bit of concrete was not going to be that difficult. So 25,000 people died. So you could, in a sense, use this as a test of how much of the death rate was due to human factors. Because 25,000 died here, 57 died in California, same earthquake. So you could justifiably say that 99.8% of those deaths were due to human factors in this particular earthquake. Well, it's pretty scary, actually, that earthquakes are hugely dangerous things, and they're getting more dangerous. As we get more technologically advanced and we understand them better and better, they're actually more and more dangerous, which sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? And my friends who are seismologists tell me that in our lifetimes there's likely to be an earthquake that kills 1 million people in one earthquake. There have already been earthquakes in China that killed 600,000 people, or thereabouts. And this is the number of events on the left-hand side that have killed more than 10,000 people, that's the yellow, or more than 50,000 people, that's the red. And you can see they're increasing with time. And for the current century, I've just predicted it based on this first decade that we're in now, what will happen if it just carries on the same. Now, some people have said to me, well, this is a sure sign of the end times, isn't it? Things are getting worse. No, that is not the case. The number of earthquakes, the magnitude of them, the distribution of them is no different than it has been for hundreds and thousands of years, because we can see their effect in the geological record. So what has changed? Well, what has changed is that the population of the world has gone up enormously. So there's 3 times more people alive today than when I was born, not that long ago. And those people are predominantly moving to big cities. So just, I think this year, the number of people living in big cities exceeded the number of people living in rural areas. And if your big city is on an earthquake fault, then it's a very dangerous place to be. And one of the, I suppose, interesting things about earthquakes is their recurrence time, the time they come back again, these big ones, is quite long. It's typically 100 years or maybe more. And so the last time, for instance, that Tehran was flattened was in about 1850s. It was not much more than a small village. It was completely flattened by an earthquake, and it had been flattened several times previously as you go back through the centuries. They just rebuild it and carry on. But Tehran now has 20 million people in it during the rush hour. So exactly the same earthquake, which will come back to Tehran and will do one day for sure, has that possibility of killing millions of people. And that's the issue, actually, that when there's been an earthquake somewhere and you rebuild it, if it's been in the last 10 or 20 years, maybe you rebuild it properly and it's safe. But that is not the dangerous place to be. The dangerous place to be is the place where there was an earthquake 100 years ago and they rebuilt it and the population has expanded hugely. and those buildings are not earthquake-proof anymore. So that's a scary thing. The cleverer we get, the more technologically advanced we get, the more dangerous these cities are, the more people are likely to be killed. And if you just plot, for instance, the numbers of cities, more than 5 or 10 million in this plot around the world, more than 5 or 10 million inhabitants. Sorry that Australia and New Zealand don't feature on this, but you're probably pleased you don't. And then you look at where earthquakes that have killed more than 10,000 or 100,000 people have occurred. They're pretty well, you can see what the correlation is, especially through the Mediterranean and through China and through Asia there, can't you? That is the issue. That is a really big issue which we're going to see coming up time and time and time again over the coming years. So earthquakes are dangerous. This is that plot of global population showing how far it's expanded. Well, what can you do about this? Obviously you can't, well, it's obvious to me, but I suppose not to everybody, you can't force people not to have children or kill the children they have or something terrible like that. And it's quite interesting to look at population predictions. These are UN population predictions for the world. Take your normal sort of expectation of economic growth and education and so on. For a medium fertility world, it will flatten out at about 9 or 10 billion people. We're at about 6 now. If there's low fertility, if we can get fertility down, it might decrease it by the end of this century more or less to the population there is now. If we carry on much as we are now, it's liable to go up to 2 or even 3 times, perhaps more than 2 times, just in this century, what the population is now. What can you do about this? Well, I think actually there are things you can do which have innate Christian resonances, actually, because they're good things to do. A replacement fertility rate is about 2.1, so every couple should have about just a bit more than 2 children to allow for those who don't get married. Or, well, of course I'm talking in terms of people getting married who don't partner. And this is what's happened in the USA and the UK over the last 50 years or so, that actually the population fertility rate, rather, has naturally decreased, so that it's below replacement rate, actually, and Britain is only held up by immigration. And that happens because the standard of living has improved, the healthcare has improved, that sort of thing. China, as you well know, had an aggressive policy of trying to decrease their population. They started off in the 70s with a regime of education, trying to get people to have longer between babies, to have them later in life, and to have fewer. That had some effect, but the real thing that kicked in was the one-child policy. You're only allowed to have 1 child, which had all sorts of side effects, which I'm sure you've heard of. Boys were more desired than girls, so girls may have been aborted more, or even worse than that. And actually the issue now is that for China, the fertility rate is below replacement level, as it happens. India also tried to bring in a voluntary, they said, population reductions regime. You might remember it was under Sanjay Gandhi. In practice, it turned out that it was the poor, the low castes, who were more or less pressurised into having vasectomies and so on, by giving them free transistor radios and that sort of thing. And actually Sanjay Gandhi and the Gandhi government was actually eventually deposed, probably because of the terrible things that went on under these enforced sterilisations. And it's left India, or Indians, with a profound dislike and also unbelieving of their government in the whole issue of population control. So actually the Indian population has stayed very high, and that's a real issue. There's over 1 billion people in India now. Interestingly, the country that did it best was Iran, and I'll tell you what they did because it's very interesting. Just after the revolution in late 70s, it was told to Iranians, your patriotic duty was to have more children, because we need them to fight their neighbours mainly. They realised after a while that they were having too many people, and so they started quite consciously for 2 years a whole regime of education in newspapers and magazines and on the radio and so on, saying, well, it was a good thing to have slightly fewer children, that was a patriotic thing, you know, because of the resources involved. And then they brought in compulsory health care for young children, compulsory education of couples before they got married about contraception, and education for women. Iran was one of the best countries, Muslim countries, for educating women. And critically, and I think this is a critical point, they got mullahs on their Friday prayers in the rural populations of largely uneducated people to actually preach that it was a good thing to have fewer children. And look what happened then to their population, their fertility rate. Absolutely plummeted, so it's now down at replacement level or below. That was not coercive at all. It was all education and provision of healthcare, empowerment of women. And those things, I think, are things we would all want to sign up for low-income countries. Better healthcare, better education, empowerment of women. And it seems to me that is the way that we have to deal with the population explosion. Sadly, in Africa, you still have 13 kids if you can, because a lot of them will die. And it's estimated that the population of Africa, which is, as you saw, the most prone to natural disasters from many different causes, will probably double by 2050. Well, let's move on to the last of the things I want to talk about of natural disasters, which are floods. Actually, neither volcanic eruptions nor earthquakes are the worst. Floods are the worst. Some of us, you may have heard me talk before, that on the 13th of November 1970, Cyclone Bopha in what is now Bangladesh killed on one night over 500,000 people. Now, what happened there is quite interesting because this was the track of the cyclone. Peak winds were 205 kilometres per second. That can't be kilometres per second, that must be kilometres per hour, I've just realised. That would be really strong wind otherwise. But it's still pretty strong wind. Did half a billion dollars worth of damage, 500,000 people died. Now, interestingly, 1991, a much worse cyclone crossed the same patch, almost identical. Peak winds 260 kilometres an hour, $2 billion worth of damage. But only, I say only, but only 144,000 people died. And there's a reason for that. If we come right forward to the most recent bad one in Bangladesh, 2007, about the same strength as that previous one, in fact, only 3,447 people died. Now, the reason was simply that they provided cyclone shelters. It wasn't a high-tech solution. They built concrete buildings that people could shelter in. You can see how long the cyclone takes to develop. You can track it. You know when it's coming. So there's not a problem in predicting it. Now, interestingly, they had done that for the previous one, for 1991. But actually, because of cultural things, the women, and it's women and children and the very old who died, primarily, not the menfolk, they died because culturally they didn't want to go into a shelter in the dark with a lot of other men they didn't know. And culturally, they were responsible for caring for the livestock and the farm while the men were out working. And so they didn't leave them and they died. Now, they got over that by 2007. And it was such low-tech solutions as having mobile phones that they could warn the villages there's a cyclone coming, and people went round with megaphones to tell people to go into places like this. Well, that's that last cyclone, to go into shelters. Now, you can say, therefore, that compared to 1970, 99.8% of those deaths were saved by cyclone shelters and early warnings. Just simple, low-tech solutions like that. I'm afraid we're not out of the woods, though, because, as you well know, last year in Burma, before and after that cyclone, there were a huge number of people died, 133,000 or thereabouts, and many millions still homeless now. And that was largely, partly due to the initial cyclone, but partly due to the government not allowing aid in properly. So China's been subject to nasty floods right through its history. 1931, maybe up to 4 million people died. In the 20th century, floods affected 100 million people per year, and by 2025, half the world's population will be at risk from this sort of danger. Lastly, I want to talk about famines. There have been China really gets hammered, doesn't it? There was a great famine in China in 1876 to 79, where between 9 and 13 million people died. And now, interestingly, there was a missionary there called Timothy Richard, and he set up the China Relief Fund. This was one of the first major relief funds that was ever put into practice. And the picture on the left is from their brochure that they sent round. Bodies lie dead on the road, the living strive together for their flesh. There's a picture of, well, I won't explain it, you can look at what that chap's doing. And Timothy wrote this. He wrote that the Christian religion, education, science and invention and investigation, and better means of communication and distribution would lead to the relief of the poor from starvation. And what he was getting at was that Confucianism, they actually knew that famines occurred. They couldn't fail to know that. They did lay up food, but they sort of didn't bother distributing it. Because it was just, well, that's how it is. That's the way it's meant to be, and so people die, that's it. What Timothy Richard was saying, let's put in roads, let's put in railways in his case, let's get aid to the places they need them. And he was saying specifically that because Christianity had this strong link between the natural world, studying the natural world, developing science and technology was a good thing, and the religion, that actually that would better serve the people than the Confucianism of the time. Well, here's a scary story, actually. The Irish potato famine of 1845 to 55, 1 million Irish died, 2 million were forced to emigrate because they had a monoculture, one particular type of potato, which led to widespread famine. The scary thing is this chap, Trevelyan, who was the Whig minister responsible for aid, responsible for Northern Ireland at the time. Now, I don't want to demonise him because he was a Christian man. He went on to do really good work in India in relief of famine there, following this. But on this occasion, he wrote this pamphlet called The Irish Crisis. He was responsible for aid. And he said this shocking thing to our minds. He saw the famine as a mechanism for reducing surplus population. And he said this, he wrote this, the judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson, that calamity must not be too much mitigated. The real evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse and turbulent character of the people. This was a guy responsible for giving aid to Ireland from the British government. And this is actually copied from his pamphlet. He said, the deep and inveterate root of social evil remained, and this has been laid bare by a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence. I guess he's all-merciful if you're sitting drinking port in London. As if this part of the case were beyond the unassisted power of man. And he went on to say, even the idea of the sharp but effectual remedy by which the cure is likely to be effected had never occurred to anyone. Well, of course it hadn't. Oh, let's just starve 1 million Irish to death, shall we? That'll cure them. God grant that the generation to which this great opportunity has been offered may rightly perform its part. This was not considered weird thinking at the time. Now, there was obviously human responsibility, at least at some level, in that famine in Ireland, which unfortunately had these moralistic overtones coming from a Christian speaker. The Ukraine famine of 32-33 has been estimated to have caused between 3 and 5 million deaths as a result of Stalin's rural collectivization policies. And Mao Zedong did a similar thing in China. His great leap forward put we'd be all out there in the paddy fields, everybody in this room. And it's been estimated that 20 to 40 million people died as a result of those policies. You can lay these at the door of man, not of God. It's been estimated that 70 million people died from famine in the 20th century. And we shouldn't be too smug because as recently as 1984, 1 million died in Ethiopia, and we knew full well what was going on. It was on our television screens in Europe. It probably was here too. Shocking statistic I said before, that 6 million people under 5 years old die every year of malnutrition. Completely avoidable. Because there's 1 billion people who are overweight in this world at the moment, and there's 850 million malnourished. You have to say there's something wrong with the way we handle our resources, don't you, if that is the case. This is not God failing to provide adequate resources. This is us abusing them, not distributing them fairly. It's a matter of injustice. Well, what about some practical issues? I don't want to dwell on this, but I do want to really pass by them, mention them a bit. One of the problems, I haven't talked about climate change, though I did on Thursday. That's an issue which speaks into nearly all of these things like famine and floods. The problem is that those of us that live in places like New Zealand and England are living in a way which is not sustainable. We're using about 3.5 times the sustainable resources of this world in the way we live at the moment. It's self-evidently, you can't go on like that. That is one of the problems. And as far as climate change is concerned, I just want to show one slide to show that if we shared the resources, if you like, the carbon pollution resources equitably, we'd have about a tonne each. Those of us in red are using far more than our fair share. Those of the countries in green are using far less. And of course, they want to be able to come up to at least the average to improve their standard of living. So the only equitable thing to do is to find a way of what people call contract and converge. We should contract and converge on a common level. Whether we'll be able to do that is a different question entirely. Well, just to highlight a few practical responses, of course, and a lot of you will be more experienced than me in this even. After a disaster, of course, humanitarian aid ought to be sent. We ought to have rapid response teams ready, and there are such things, of course. And one of the heartening things, I suppose, that came out of that Asian tsunami on Boxing Day was it's been estimated that 80% of all British families sent aid to the victims of that. Now, I suspect partly it's because many Brits have been on holiday in Sumatra, but even so, that was heartening. I suspect that if it had been in Bangladesh, there wouldn't have been such an outpouring of aid because they didn't know Bangladesh. But nevertheless, that providing aid is obviously a Christian response. It's a humanitarian response. Before disasters, there are things you can do, as I've talked about today, building codes and implementing them so that corruption doesn't prevent them being implemented, building flood defences, or such simple things as early warnings from mobile phones and megaphones, typhoon shelters. The third one is obviously something that everyone in this room ought to think about because we are part of the problem. We ought to consider what we do. I'm not saying we should stop doing the things we do, but we ought to be conscious of the impact we have. Everything we do has a consequence, often for other people, and if it's a bad consequence, it'll be for people who are poorest and least able to respond themselves. And so that bottom one of social justice is one that I know many Christians have been very active in, talking about things like fair trade, providing affordable drugs, trying to get drugs developed for diseases which affect low-income countries rather than putting all your resources into the very small diseases that affect those of us in high-income countries, and so on. And I guess this is a stern warning, isn't it, to each one of us. From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. From the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. It's pretty clear which part of that category all of us in this room sit in. Much has been given to us already. Well, for the last 5 minutes, let me just talk about a few theological issues that we might consider. I think, as Jeff said, suffering is perhaps the preeminent problem with which Christendom has struggled, actually, for the last 2 millennia. So I'm not going to be able to solve those problems. And I'm very conscious that I'm standing up here, as it were, speaking from an armchair position. And really we ought to be speaking from a wheelchair, not an armchair, if we're talking about suffering. And because for sure every one of us here is going to suffer at some time in our life. And in a group of people of this size, there will be people who are suffering terribly now. It's almost certain that is the case. And so I want to temper what I say with that in the background, the compassion that ought to bring up in each one of us. Well, there's been a number of theological positions taken for how to square the idea of suffering and a good God. And Leibniz was one of the first, that we live in the best of all possible worlds, that suffering is inevitable. Like all of these positions, I think, have some element of truth in them. But I'm not convinced that any of them hold the whole truth. That's one position some have taken. Suffering is a necessary consequence of this world, of free will, as Jeff said. Other people have talked about this world as a veil of soul-making, that actually a bit of suffering is good for us. It will make us into the people we might be for all eternity. Now, it is true that people's strength of character, their faith, often blossoms under hardship and suffering. That is, I've seen it with awe, actually, in other people. But I find it hard to believe that God would make a world where that was a necessary consequence. So there is some truth in that. Some people have said that true love can only be shown if there is real suffering. Other people have said that everything that happens that's bad is just a result of the fall, so that's a nice equation. We'll just leave it at that. In fact, this is a tack which Roger Carswell took in a very recent book, Where is God in a Messed Up World? I think this owes more, actually, to Milton's Paradise Lost than it does to the Bible, but nevertheless, he said, the paradise which God had created on earth had no pollution, no physical calamities such as floods, earthquakes, hurricanes or tsunamis. The perfect world created by God was to be wrecked and ruined in an instant when the first man and woman deliberately disobeyed God, insisting that they should discover evil. Well, I'm afraid we can't take that at face value. There were earthquakes, there were hurricanes, there were tsunamis, there were floods long before humans ever walked on this earth. And in fact, if it weren't for those floods and volcanoes, it would not be a habitable world. It would not be the fruitful world ripe with potentiality in which we live, which makes life possible. So the earthquakes, which are a consequence of plate tectonics, are what moves material from deep in the earth to the surface, so it can be used in organic processes and so on. So this really won't do, although it is true that the fall has obviously put creation out of kilter. It's as if the beautiful thing that God made has been marred and distorted, and we see it not in the way he meant it to be. My quotes are, I'm afraid, much shorter than Jeff's, so here's my Augustine quote, nature is what God does. Pretty straightforward. Now, sometimes people draw a distinction between moral evil and natural evil, as if the world itself can be bad and it's people that do other bad things. I don't think you can make that distinction because of this, because nature is what God does. Nature is God, if you like, acting in the world. That's the way he is. John Wesley, just after that same Lisbon earthquake, he said, what is nature itself but the art of God, or God's method of acting in the material world? He said almost the same thing as Augustine. So we can't just say, well, there's some things about the material world that are bad, and that's just it, and there's some things that humans do that are bad, that's just it. It's not that simple. God, when he made the world, and we've talked already about that wonderful mission statement, as Jeff mentioned, he didn't call it a mission statement, I have, in Genesis 1. Every time God made something, he saw that it was good. You can't fail to see God's message. The theological message of Genesis 1 is that material creation is good, that matter matters to God. On the last day, he sat back, looked at everything he'd made, including humankind, and said it was very good. Now, we can't really say that earthquakes are bad. And as I tried to say earlier, it's not the natural process which is bad. It's humans that often turn a natural process into a natural disaster. And a lot of it is, I'm afraid, due to disobedience of God. We've usurped his position as creator with ourselves as his creatures and wanted to put ourselves in charge. And heaven forbid if we ran the world. You often hear people say, if I was God, I wouldn't allow suffering. If I was God, I wouldn't do this. Well, heaven forbid if I was God, because we've tried to be God. We've tried to put ourselves in place of God. We've said, thy will be done, my will be done, not thine. And that is the root cause of a lot of the social, political, and other injustices that we see today, a lot of the consequences of natural disasters. Well, we've been reminded of what the Apostle Paul said already, that creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God in the fullness of time when the new creation comes. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And the reason for that, I think, is that humans have not played their proper part in caring for the world, in having dominion, ruling, stewarding the world, in the way that God commanded us to in Genesis 1:28, right at the beginning. And so creation itself cannot reflect God's glory in the way he made it to be because we've marred that image, we prevent it doing it. And in the fullness of time in the new creation it will be able to. Well, just in the last few minutes then, I just want to reflect, that's just some background on the theology, I want to reflect just on 4 incidents, 2 from the Old Testament, 2 from the New, which might help inform us as we consider this deep problem of suffering and pain in the world. The first one is that story, which is a natural disaster. Actually, it's a famine in Genesis 50. When you remember, Joseph had been he'd been got rid of by his brothers because they didn't want him. He ended up in Egypt. He foresaw a famine through God's graciousness to him, mercy to him, laid up food and had food when the famine came, and then his brothers came pleading to him for food and for mercy. And when Joseph eventually showed himself to his brothers, this is what he said. He said, "As for you, you meant evil against me." And they really did. They really wanted to kill him. They threw him down a well, you remember. Then he pulled him out and sold him to some camel traders. You meant evil against me. There's no doubt they did. But God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. Now, I think this makes the point that really the position I want to take is that God is sovereign. He really, really is sovereign. He really does know what's going on in this world. He knows every hair on our head. He knows every sparrow that falls. I want to hold to that without reservation. We don't have a God, I think, from reading the Bible, who doesn't know the future, as some people have said, who's like a master chess player, so whatever we do in our free will, he's such a clever player that he can get to the end point he wants because he's a better chess player than us. Because that would mean I'm a pawn in his game. And when we're suffering, that is not a very helpful thing to say pastorally to somebody when you sit alongside them, is it? Joseph makes it clear God was sovereign. God meant it for good. The other person from the Old Testament I'd just like to look at is Job, who you remember was a righteous man, and God allowed Satan to send all sorts of things, but God always said you can go this far and no further, and Satan kept pushing him to go further and further, but always God was sovereign over Satan. God allowed him to go this far and no further. This is a painting from the 6th century, northern Mesopotamia. There's his wife, who you remember said he was stupid. He should just curse God and die. He's covered in sores, he's lying on a dung heap. And these are his 3 friends who actually did rather well for the first 7 days. They just sat by him quietly. But then after that, they started to get rather cocky, and they said, look, the reason you're suffering, Job, is because you've done this, or you've done that wrong, or you've done the other one. They wanted a very instrumental one-on-one equation. You did that, so therefore you're suffering. A bit like the tsunami. You died because you did that wrong. And actually, when you get down to it, God gives a beautiful speech, of which I'm just going to show you a few extracts, really worth reading, in Job 38. And God effectively says to Job, I'm the creator God, not you. How can you know what my purposes are? Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. There's a certain irony here, isn't there? Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched a line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together? And I'm actually showing this against a backdrop of the oldest known galaxy in the universe, created just 1.3 billion years after the Big Bang, which was 13.7 billion years ago. And God talks about all sorts of other natural things. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion? God is God, and he is sovereign, and his purposes are not our purposes. His understanding is way beyond ours. And actually, Job's response was this, when he heard this. He said, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Therefore, I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know, which actually gives me pause for thought for trying to explain suffering. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust of ashes, was Job's righteous Job, righteous throughout. That was his quite proper response to God. And actually, in this particular story, the Lord restored the fortunes of Job. When he'd prayed for his friends, he gave Job twice as much as he had before. That may not be the case for each of us in this world, but it certainly is in the new creation. And then quickly, 2 New Testament ones. Jesus was asked the same sort of problem. A tower fell down and killed 18 people, and they came to Jesus and said, was it their sin or was it their father's sin that caused them to die? And Jesus, like he so often did, just deflected. He said, that's the wrong question to be asking, which should give us pause for thought. He said, do you think that they were worse offenders than all the others who lived in Jerusalem? No, I tell you, said Jesus, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. Jesus was pointing to the truth that the death that is separation from God is the worst death that is possible. Physical death is not the danger. It's because death has been defeated on the cross. It's that spiritual death which is separation from God. is what we should be most scared about. And then the very last reference from Revelation 21, when the new creation will be made, when things will be put right, when we'll be in the right relationship with God, which he intended all along, when God will walk with his people, just as he did in the Garden of Eden, in the cool of the evening. The dwelling place of God will be with man. He will dwell with them, they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. And that is the great hope, I think, that Christians have to look forward to. And I think that's the great hope we obviously ought to be proclaiming. C.S. Lewis said this, he said, the Christians who did most for the present world were precisely those who thought most of the next. And he said the reason is this, aim at heaven and you get earth thrown in. If you aim at earth, you get neither. And so I'll finish with this slide of Christ being crucified on the cross, where he took our suffering on himself, where he knows our suffering at a depth we cannot possibly imagine. And I think that is the ultimate thing that you can say about suffering, that Christ has taken the burden of it, and he knows it, and because of that, we are free of it in the long term, in the new creation. Thank you.
Right, perhaps time for just one question now, and then we should break for morning tea, which I believe by faith is out there. Can we have one question, and we can come back later to have more questions towards the end of the day.
There is one in the middle.
I've just got a brief comment on your slides about fertility. The fertility rates in Spain, Italy and Japan for middle-class educated women are about 1.5 or less for women. And interestingly enough, the highest fertility rates are actually in Scandinavia and Iceland. And the reason seems to be not just to do with access to childcare, is because of societal structures in Spain, Italy and Japan. Basically assume that the women have to look after the elders and actually agree that they need a very little domestic chores. The interesting aspect of relationship to this conference is that it's not effective that religious structures actually try to restrict access to contraception. That religious structures actually try to reduce the patriarchal attitudes. We actually have more domestic input from men to childcare and so forth. That's where the fertility rates actually rise in the middle class world.
Yes, no, thank you. I mean, the Iranian example is an interesting one, where religion actually certainly didn't restrict access to anything, did the opposite. Yeah, thanks.